This is an analysis from Alpha Business Media.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are looking at a scenario that plays out, well, daily at the border of Nepal and India, and it really illustrates a major shift in global trade dynamics.
Yeah, it's a fascinating and honestly pretty brutal reality.
Right. So I want you to picture this. You are a ginger farmer in Ilam, Nepal. For an entire year, you've invested your capital, your labor, just everything into the soil. You've navigated the weather, optimized your yields, and finally, you've harvested.
Which is a massive undertaking on its own.
Exactly. So you load a commercial truck with your carefully graded produce, and it begins that long mountain descent toward the Indian border crossing. Now, in a standard free trade environment, this is just the final logistical step before you recognize your revenue.
But that's not what happens here.
No. Instead, your shipment is abruptly halted. And it's not stopped by a traditional transparent border tax. It's stopped by an invisible, completely unpredictable, and entirely legal administrative wall.
It's a systemic choke point. And, for countless agricultural exporters operating in these asymmetrical trade relationships around the world, this specific type of disruption, it isn't an anomaly. It is the fundamental operating environment.
Our source material for this analysis is a really comprehensive brief titled Exporting to India, Non-Tariff Barriers for Nepal Agriculture. And the mission of this deep dive is to unpack the hidden mechanisms of these non-tariff barriers.
Often referred to as NTBs in the policy world.
Right, NTBs. We're going to examine how they function as de facto protectionism, the political economy driving their deployment, and the strategic pivots required for a smaller economy to survive when it's tethered to an overwhelmingly dominant trading partner.
But before we begin unpacking the mechanics of this border friction, we really need to establish the parameters of our analysis today. Because the source text deals heavily with the political and economic friction between Nepal and India, we want to be absolutely clear with you, the listener.
Yes, very important point.
Our exploration of these geopolitical and economic strategies is entirely objective.
We are not taking sides here. And we're definitely not endorsing any specific political narrative from either nation. Our goal is strictly to analyze the factual arguments, the legal loopholes, and the structural realities of trade exactly as they are detailed in our source material.
Right. We're simply analyzing the anatomy of a system that converts a supposedly open commercial gateway into a highly calibrated strategic filter.
Okay, let's unpack this. Under regional frameworks like the South Asian Free Trade Area, traditional transparent tariffs are, well, they're virtually a thing of the past.
They're obsolete.
Yeah, because a classical tariff is a known variable, right? You can model it into your pricing strategy before a single truck is even loaded. But while those transparent taxes have disappeared on paper, the border friction hasn't vanished at all. It has simply mutated into sanitary and phytosanitary measures, commonly known as SPS measures.
And on the surface, SPS measures are entirely foundational to international trade. I mean, they're regulations instituted to protect human, animal, and plant life from risks arising from additives, toxins, or genuine agricultural pests. Every sovereign nation uses them.
Here.
But the critical insight from our source material is the methodology behind their deployment. In practice, these public health measures are frequently weaponized to shield domestic producers from foreign competition.
But playing devil's advocate here, isn't rigorous testing for pesticide residue or invasive pests just responsible public policy? If a border authority wants to verify the safety of imported food, why should that automatically be categorized as a hostile trade barrier?
It's a fair question. The distinction really lies in a concept the source refers to as weaponized ambiguity.
Weaponized ambiguity.
Exactly. The issue is not the existence of a safety standard, but the sudden, arbitrary, and selective enforcement of that standard. Let's go back to your Nepali ginger export scenario. Historically, these shipments might cross the border seamlessly with standard documentation.
Business as usual.
Right. Then, without any prior diplomatic notification or regulatory update, border authorities will abruptly halt all trucks. And they'll demand a highly specific pesticide residue analysis. They'll suddenly require laboratory proof that the ginger is free of a deeply obscure list of chemicals.
So the exporter is hit with a compliance requirement they couldn't possibly have forecasted. And suddenly you have dozens of commercial trucks physically stranded at congested crossings like Kakarbida or Raxol.
While the exporter is frantically searching for a laboratory capable of executing this newly mandated, highly specific chemical analysis.
And the delay itself is the weapon, isn't it?
The delay is the actual weapon because by the time the exporter secures that specific certification, which is a process that can consume days or even weeks, two critical shifts have occurred in the market.
Right.
First, the ginger sitting in those trucks has severely degraded in quality, which completely destroys its premium pricing. Second, and vastly more important, India's domestic ginger harvest has had the necessary time to flood the market, satisfying demand and depressing wholesale prices.
Wow. So the non-tariff barrier achieved its primary objective perfectly.
Exactly. It inflicted catastrophic financial damage on the foreign competitor and protected domestic market share without technically violating the overarching free trade agreement.
And it's not just ginger. That same subjective playbook is being used on Nepal's prized large cardamom, known locally as a lychee. According to the text, buyers or customs officials will spontaneously reject entire consignments based on highly subjective, unquantifiable criteria.
Like what?
Well, they'll cite high moisture content, or they'll claim the presence of unspecified foreign matter, or they might even argue that the essential oil levels don't meet an arbitrary visual standard.
And because those testing parameters are entirely subjective and applied retroactively, the exporter has zero legal or procedural recourse. I mean, there is no rapid appellate court for a stalled truck.
Right, and the financial exposure becomes astronomical when you apply this tactic to highly perishable goods, like tomatoes or green beans.
Oh, perishables are a whole different game.
For perishables, the preferred bureaucratic tool is the sudden quarantine alert. Border authorities will issue an emergency alert for a fruit fly or a leaf blight. But what really stands out in the data is the precise timing of these phytosanitary alerts.
They're not random.
Not at all. They almost universally coincide with the peak supply seasons of neighboring Indian agricultural states.
Because a quarantine alert legally halts all imports pending a comprehensive inspection. And as the source text starkly illustrates, for a perishable commodity, the delay itself is the ultimate penalty. A truckload of fresh tomatoes stranded at a border crossing in 40-degree tropical heat.
It's gone.
It will lose its entire commercial value in 48 hours. The economic devastation to the exporter is identical to a 100% import tariff.
Yet the implementing nation can defend the action globally under the guise of protecting public health and agricultural biosecurity.
And the text makes it clear that these are not isolated logistical errors. They aren't the actions of rogue customs agents. This is a calculated systemic architecture. The inconsistency is the design. It generates maximum strategic uncertainty.
Because if an agricultural exporter cannot guarantee delivery times, their risk profile becomes toxic. They are structurally prohibited from securing reliable, high-volume supply contracts with major Indian distributors.
And that uncertainty dismantles the fundamental competitiveness of the entire export sector.
So, when policymakers look at this friction, the default, well-intentioned advice is usually centered on domestic capacity building. The argument goes, if Nepal's products are being rejected for lack of testing, Nepal just needs to build more laboratories and upgrade its domestic testing infrastructure. It seems like a perfectly rational, linear solution.
It does appear rational, but our source text systematically dismantles that premise. The primary bottleneck is not a lack of scientific hardware, mass spectrometers, or domestic testing capacity. The core deficit is a complete lack of bilateral diplomatic recognition. This entire geopolitical friction points back to a single missing instrument, a mutual recognition agreement, or MRA.
For those navigating supply chains outside of international trade policy, an MRA is a formal treaty between two nations. It legally binds them to accept each other's conformity assessments. So, if Nepal and India had a fully ratified functional MRA covering agricultural commodities, a safety certificate issued by a recognized Nepali government lab for a shipment of cardamom would carry the exact same legal weight as an Indian certificate.
The border authorities would be legally required to accept it.
Right.
But without that binding agreement, you are left with a massive asymmetry of infrastructure. The text maps out a workflow that is mathematically designed for failure.
How so?
Well, an exporter arrives at the Indian border holding a clean, scientifically rigorous certificate from Nepal's own government food technology department. The Indian customs officer legally ignores it.
Just throws it out.
Basically, yes. Because under Indian law, that piece of paper holds zero authority. The officer is mandated to demand a completely new conformity assessment conducted exclusively by an Indian laboratory that holds specific accreditation from India's national board.
And the logistics of that mandatory retest are staggering. The border official extracts a physical sample from the stranded truck. That biological sample must then be transported, often by road, to an approved Indian laboratory, which could be situated hundreds of kilometers away from the actual border post.
So you introduce compounding delays, redundant testing costs, and a secondary point of catastrophic failure, all while the primary cargo sits degrading in the sun.
What the source highlights as a particularly tragic irony is that Nepal's domestic policy response has actually exacerbated their own vulnerability. In an attempt to show progress, the domestic strategy has been to construct small, provincial laboratories scattered across the country.
It fragments their capital.
Exactly. By fragmenting their already limited capital, they have created a network of underfunded, understaffed facilities. None of these localized labs possess the capacity to achieve the rigorous, internationally recognized accreditations, such as the ISO 14025 standard, that are the absolute prerequisite for negotiating a credible mutual recognition agreement with a sovereign power like India.
The source offers a devastating analogy for this localized approach. Building these unaccredited provincial labs without first securing the diplomatic MRA is the equivalent of building a state-of-the-art manufacturing facility with no physical road connecting it to the consumer market.
A bridge to nowhere.
Precisely. You can execute the most rigorous domestic scientific tests in the world. But if the resulting documentation is not legally recognized at the destination border, the entire exercise is commercially worthless.
Meanwhile, the exporter is forced to compete on India's home turf, navigating India's labyrinthine regulatory framework, utilizing India's domestic infrastructure. It's an unwinnable equation until the diplomatic strategy pivots entirely away from firefighting daily border crises
And focuses exclusively on the tedious, multi-year process of negotiating binding MRAs for specific high-value commodities.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because looking at the laboratory infrastructure only gives us a fraction of the total picture. To comprehend why these non-tariff barriers materialize overnight, we have to examine the raw political economy operating inside the importing nation. We have to analyze what the source calls the onion principle.
The onion principle. In massive, diverse democracies like India, the retail price of foundational agricultural staples, onions, tomatoes, potatoes, carries immense political volatility.
Fluctuations in the price of an onion have historically toppled state governments and dictated national election cycles.
Yes, the political sensitivity attached to a vegetable's price tag is absolute.
And this is the environment where regulatory protectionism becomes fully weaponized. Consider a scenario where an influx of lower-priced Nepali agricultural produce begins crossing the border. In the macroeconomic context of India's total consumption, the volume might be a statistical rounding error.
A drop in the bucket.
Right. However, if that specific influx threatens to depress wholesale prices for domestic farmers in politically vital, densely populated states like Uttar Pradesh or West Bengal, right at the climax of their harvest season, the political mandate to block that foreign produce becomes an existential priority for incumbent lawmakers.
The local and central governments are under massive pressure to protect their agrarian voting blocs. But legally, they cannot simply levy a sweeping import tariff. Doing so would violate their commitments under the South Asian Free Trade Area and trigger immediate, highly visible diplomatic fallout.
Therefore, the non-tariff barrier provides the ultimate political utility. It is immediate, it is highly effective at halting supply, and crucially, it offers absolute plausible deniability.
Right. A regulatory ministry can simply issue a memo stating they are enhancing enforcement measures of an existing food safety standard to protect the domestic consumer.
So the public-facing narrative is entirely focused on biosecurity and consumer safety. But the underlying economic reality is that the foreign exporter is simply acceptable collateral damage in the importing nation's internal electoral calculus.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of global trade, you might wonder how the World Trade Organization permits this localized maneuvering. The answer lies in a massive structural loophole within the WTO's Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement. The framework allows sovereign nations to establish their own baseline standards for food safety, provided those measures are based on scientific principles and are not disguised restrictions on international trade.
And the fatal ambiguity is the phrase scientific principles. A colossal regulatory apparatus like India's can effortlessly generate documentation to satisfy that definition. They can cite a newly published entomology paper detailing a theoretical pest risk, or reference an obscure European concern regarding a specific agricultural additive.
For a smaller economy like Nepal, the prospect of formally challenging that scientific justification through the WTO's dispute settlement body in Geneva is practically a non-starter. The burden of proof shifts to the complaining nation. The legal fees are astronomical, the evidentiary requirements are staggering, and the bureaucratic timeline stretches into years.
By the time the WTO arbitration panel finally issues a ruling determining that a specific fruit fly was not a legitimate biosecurity threat, half a decade has passed. The initial shipments have long since rotted, the export consortiums have dissolved into bankruptcy, and the domestic farming base has abandoned the crop entirely. The legal victory is entirely Pyrrhic.
And the author of the brief stresses that this dynamic isn't necessarily a coordinated, malicious conspiracy. It's simply the natural mechanical outcome of a bilateral trade relationship defined by a massive imbalance of power. The larger nation exercises its regulatory sovereignty to optimize outcomes for its own domestic constituencies.
So, what does this all mean? If you are a chief executive running a supply chain, or a macroeconomic policymaker trying to stabilize a nation's GDP, how do you adapt to an environment where strategic disruption is the permanent baseline? The source text outlines two highly divergent scenarios for the future.
The first scenario is designated the inertial path. This represents the extreme danger of maintaining the current operating procedure. If the exporting nation continues to rely on ad hoc, frantic diplomatic phone calls to clear stranded trucks on a case-by-case basis, while simultaneously dispersing capital across unaccredited provincial laboratories, the macro situation will aggressively deteriorate.
The brief refers to this trajectory as death by 1,000 cuts. As the importing nation's own agricultural sectors become more advanced and politically organized, these invisible regulatory walls will only become more frequent, more scientifically sophisticated, and harder to dismantle.
Exporters will face permanently compressed margins. They'll remain structurally incapable of scaling their operations due to the perpetual supply chain uncertainty.
Ultimately, this path accelerates the erosion of the nation's agricultural foundation, driving the labor force outward and deepening a precarious reliance on foreign remittance income to sustain the national economy.
Which brings us to scenario 2, the resilience and compliance path. This demands a radical shift in operational psychology. It requires an acknowledgement that the regulatory friction is a permanent feature, not a bug, and that businesses must systematically master the compliance game to survive.
On the microeconomic level, export enterprises must evolve beyond fragmented individual operations. They must consolidate into heavily capitalized consortia. They need to pool their resources to construct proprietary, internationally accredited cold storage infrastructure directly adjacent to the border checkpoints.
Furthermore, these supply chain operators must aggressively recruit specialized legal counsel and technical auditors who possess a granular understanding of the importing nation's specific food safety regulations, in this case, the FSSAI frameworks.
The goal is to achieve a state of preemptive, unassailable overcompliance before the agricultural product is even loaded onto the transport vehicle. You neutralize the barrier by removing any plausible pretext for rejection.
On the macroeconomic level, the state must enact a brutal consolidation of its resources. The government must completely abandon the politically popular but functionally useless strategy of funding dozens of regional laboratories. All of that capital and human expertise must be aggressively channeled into the establishment of a single, world-class national reference laboratory.
One supreme facility armed with indisputable top-tier international accreditations. Once that facility is operational, the entire apparatus of the nation's trade diplomacy must be singularly focused on leveraging that lab's credibility to negotiate a binding mutual recognition agreement.
And you don't start with highly volatile, high-volume perishables. You start by securing an MRA for specialized, high-value, low-volume commodities like orthodox tea and large cardamom, establishing a precedent of mutual trust.
But this raises an important question. Even if an exporting nation executes scenario 2 perfectly, there is a harsh strategic reality underpinning this entire analysis.
Yeah, these compliance measures, while absolutely necessary, are fundamentally defensive. Even with world-class logistics and flawless paperwork, you are still permanently ceding control of your economic destiny to the shifting political priorities and regulatory whims of a foreign power.
The source makes this point emphatically clear for any business leader or trade minister. If your entire economic strategy relies on a single adjacent market to absorb over 65% of your total trade volume, and that specific market has the unilateral capability to sever your access using opaque, invisible regulatory walls, that is not a viable long-term strategy.
It's a chronic existential liability.
Of course, the dominant nation is going to prioritize the economic survival of its own voting farmers over foreign imports. Expecting them to act otherwise is defined by the source as pure strategic negligence.
Which points us toward the ultimate, inescapable conclusion of this policy analysis. The only mathematical way to fundamentally mitigate this level of systemic risk is through aggressive, structural market diversification.
So the only rational play left is to fundamentally change the game through market diversification. And the text makes a critical distinction here. Pivoting away from an over-reliance on a neighboring superpower is not an act of diplomatic hostility, it is an act of basic macroeconomic self-preservation.
Consider the immense reserves of capital, time, and diplomatic leverage currently being burned simply to maintain a fragile, unpredictable access to a single border. What if those exact same resources were redeployed to penetrate markets that operate on transparent, stable regulatory frameworks?
Redirecting compliance infrastructure toward environments where the rules of engagement are fixed. The initial logistical barriers to establishing air or sea freight routes to hubs like Dubai or Kuala Lumpur are undeniably formidable. The capital expenditure required to establish those new supply chains is immense.
However, the cost of regulatory compliance in those markets, while high, is defined by stability and transparency. The phytosanitary standards demanded by the European Union or the United States are incredibly stringent, but they are entirely predictable. Once an exporter calibrates their supply chain to meet those specific parameters, the market access remains secure.
For commodities like ginger and turmeric, vast, highly structured consumer markets exist in Bangladesh and the broader Middle East. For specialized, high-margin agricultural products like orthodox tea and medicinal herbs, the European bloc offers massive untapped potential.
The short-term pain of financing the logistics, mastering new international marketing channels, and upgrading to global phytosanitary standards will be severe. But that localized pain buys the exporting nation the one asset it currently lacks: economic sovereignty.
It permanently uncouples a nation's most vital productive sectors from the internal political volatility of a single trading partner.
The overarching takeaway from the analysis is that the paradigm has shifted. For national planners and supply chain executives alike, the calculation is no longer whether they can afford the friction of diversifying their markets, but whether they can survive the compounding cost of failing to do so.
I want to connect this structural analysis back to you, the listener, for a moment, because the core mechanics of risk we've discussed today extend far beyond the parameters of international agricultural trade. Consider the architecture of your own enterprise. Whether you are scaling a technology startup, managing a multinational corporate division, or strategically charting your own professional career trajectory.
If your revenue, your supply chain, or your professional advancement is overwhelmingly tethered to a single, unpredictable client or a single volatile platform,
you are not operating from a position of strength, you are managing a chronic liability. Diversification, whether it is expanding your client base, broadening your technical skill set, or establishing redundant supply routes, is the ultimate, non-negotiable shield against systemic uncertainty.
it's the foundational requirement for building true operational resilience in any environment where the rules of the game can be altered without your consent.
We have dissected a massive amount of structural complexity today, from the weaponized ambiguity of phytosanitary testing protocols to the raw political economy dictating the price of domestic staples and the vital strategic necessity of mutual recognition agreements. But as we close out this analysis, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over, something that builds on the geopolitical mechanics we've mapped out today.
We really must consider what happens when the underlying environmental variables fundamentally alter the equation.
Exactly. Consider this trajectory. If accelerating climate change continues to drastically disrupt domestic agricultural yields, shift rainfall patterns, and violently alter harvest timings all across South Asia over the coming decades, how might these currently invisible walls of trade evolve?
Will they transform from mere economic shields designed to protect local profit margins into absolute hardline weapons of national food security?
And as the dominant global powers increasingly scramble to hoard caloric resources and protect their own populations at any cost, what happens to the smaller, dependent nations caught in the crossfire?
It is a profound, deeply unsettling question regarding the future stability of the global trade apparatus.
Something critical to factor into your long-term modeling. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We will see you next time.